At 6:15 on the morning of July 30th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth climbed into the tail of a B-17 bomber at a fog-covered airfield in eastern England. The aircraft's engines were already rumbling, shaking the cold metal skin beneath his boots. Outside, the sky was a dull gray, the kind of sky that promised trouble. Aruth was 24 years old. He had flown 12 combat missions. He had already shot down 3 enemy fighters. In less than an hour, this aircraft would be flying at 25,000 feet, heading straight toward Nazi-controlled Europe. 500 miles of enemy airspace waited ahead. Michael Aruth was the tail gunner. He crawled backward through the narrow fuselage until the aircraft tapered into a cone of aluminum and glass. His entire world shrank to a space barely 4 feet wide and 5 feet long. There was no room to stand, no room to stretch. Only a small bicycle-style seat bolted to the floor, 2 heavy machine guns, and a curved plexiglass window that faced the sky behind the bomber. Once the hatch was sealed, Aruth would be completely alone. 40 feet of metal separated him from the rest of the crew. No one could reach him during combat. No one could help him if something went wrong. The 8th Air Force had a name for his job. They called it the loneliest position in the war. At altitude, the temperature outside would plunge to nearly minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. If his electrically heated flight suit failed, frostbite would set in within minutes. If the oxygen system malfunctioned, he would lose consciousness just as quickly. And if German fighters came from behind, he would be the first man they tried to kill. German pilots preferred rear attacks. Approaching from the 6 o'clock position gave them the longest firing window and the clearest shot. The tail gunner absorbed the opening burst. If he died instantly, the bomber usually followed. Statistics made that reality brutally clear. In the summer of 1943, the average American bomber crew survived 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. Tail gunners died faster than anyone except the men trapped inside ball turrets. Michael Aruth knew those numbers. He had watched empty bunks appear in barracks. He had seen aircraft fail to return. He also knew something else. The official training manuals, the doctrine every gunner was taught, were getting men killed. And today, flying deep into Germany, Michael Aruth was preparing to break every rule he had been given. The threat Michael Aruth faced was not abstract. It was mathematical. German fighter commanders understood geometry better than fear. They knew that a bomber flying straight and level could not turn quickly. They knew that an approach from directly behind offered time, precious seconds to aim, adjust, and fire. A German fighter closing from the 6 o'clock position at 350 miles per hour had nearly 10 seconds of uninterrupted firing time before overshooting the bomber. 10 seconds was an eternity. For the tail gunner, those same 10 seconds were all he would ever get. The German aircraft most often sent against American bombers were fast, heavily armed, and purpose-built for interception. Messerschmitt fighters and Focke-Wulf interceptors carried cannons capable of tearing through aluminum, plexiglass, and human flesh in a single burst. One accurate pass could shatter the tail section, kill the gunner instantly, and disable the bomber's controls. A bomber without tail protection rarely survived a second attack. Once the rear defenses were silenced, fighters would circle back calmly, lining up methodical killing passes until the aircraft fell from the sky. The U.S. Army Air Forces believed they had solved this problem on paper. Their doctrine was simple. Tail gunners were trained to wait, conserve ammunition, fire only when the enemy closed within 300 yards. The theory sounded logical in a classroom. Ammunition was limited. Accuracy mattered more than volume. A disciplined gunner, instructors said, could make 800 rounds last an entire mission, but combat did not respect theory. At 300 yards, German fighters were already firing. By the time a tail gunner squeezed the trigger, shells were already punching through the plexiglass bubble. Aruth had seen it happen with his own eyes. On an earlier mission, a bomber flying beside his own took a direct hit to the tail. The fighter came in fast. The gunner never fired a single round. The first burst shattered the window. The second burst killed the man inside. The aircraft slipped out of formation, trailing smoke. 8 parachutes appeared. The tail gunners never did. Michael Aruth replayed that moment again and again in his mind. German pilots had learned the American playbook. They knew exactly when the gunners would open fire. They exploited the delay with brutal efficiency. To Aruth, the conclusion was unavoidable. Waiting was not discipline. Waiting was surrender. If the enemy was willing to shoot from long range, then the defense had to begin even earlier. And if that meant breaking doctrine, then doctrine would have to break. Michael Arrouth did not arrive at his conclusion overnight. He tested it carefully, one mission at a time. The problem, as he saw it, was not skill. It was timing. A fighter approaching head-on or from the rear presented a large, predictable target. At long range, the aircraft flew straight, nose pointed directly at the bomber. Its apparent size doubled every few seconds as the distance closed. A gunner who opened fire early could see his tracers fall short, then adjust. He could walk the stream of bullets onto the target, correcting aim as the range collapsed. The risk was ammunition. 800 rounds sounded generous until they were divided by the number of attacks a mission could attract. 15 attacks. 20, sometimes more. At 50 rounds per burst, the math turned unforgiving. Fire too early, too often, and the guns would run dry long before home appeared on the horizon. Arrouth accepted that risk. A gunner who conserved ammunition but died during the first attack had made a terrible trade. His first deliberate test came weeks earlier, during a raid against German submarine pens on the French coast. 2 enemy fighters appeared low and behind, lining up in the classic tail attack. The doctrine said wait. Arrouth did not. At nearly 700 yards, he opened fire. The twin machine guns thundered, their tracers arcing across the open sky. At first, the rounds fell short. Then they climbed. The German pilot saw the fire coming and broke away, diving sharply before reaching effective cannon range. His wingman followed. Neither fighter fired a single shot at the bomber. After landing, the crew chief checked the ammunition count. Nearly 200 rounds expended. At that rate, Arrouth would run dry long before deep penetration missions ended. The crew chief was unconvinced. So were other gunners. Word spread quickly. Some called the tactic reckless. Others said it violated everything they had been taught. Training manuals existed for a reason, they argued. Doctrine saved lives. But Arrouth's aircraft kept returning. Mission after mission, his bomber landed intact. Other aircraft in the squadron did not. By midsummer, losses were mounting. Entire crews were disappearing from the roster. And as July 30th approached, Michael Arrouth climbed into the tail of his bomber knowing that this mission, deep into Germany, would decide whether his instincts were right. If he was wrong, the cost would be measured in bodies. The bomber formation lifted off in waves that morning, engines clawing at the damp English air. Hundreds of aircraft assembled over the countryside, forming long, staggered streams that stretched across the sky. Michael Arrouth checked his equipment methodically. Ammunition belts fed cleanly into both guns, 800 rounds in total. The manuals said it was enough. He had already decided the manuals were wrong. The formation crossed the English Channel at 14,000 feet, still climbing. Below, the water faded into a dull gray sheet. Ahead lay occupied France, then Belgium, then Germany itself. For a time, American fighter escorts circled the bombers. Their presence brought a fragile sense of safety. But fuel was arithmetic, not optimism. The escorts could remain only so long. Long before the bombers reached their target, the fighters would turn back. Arrouth watched it happen, just as he knew it would. One by one, the escorts wagged their wings and peeled away, returning toward England. The bomber stream pressed on alone. Somewhere ahead, hundreds of German fighters were waiting. The first contacts appeared late in the morning, small shapes climbing from below, forming into groups of 4, then 8, then more than he could count. Black crosses filled the sky behind the formation. The lead attackers dove from high 6 o'clock, gravity adding speed to their descent. Their silhouettes grew rapidly in Arrouth's sight. He did not wait. At long range, he squeezed both triggers. The guns roared, filling the tail compartment with vibration and noise. Tracers streaked backward through the thin air, falling short, then rising as Arrouth adjusted. At 600 yards, flashes erupted along the enemy fighter's engine cowling. The pilot broke hard to the side, smoke trailing from the aircraft. Another fighter followed, then another. The attacks did not stop. For nearly an hour, German fighters slashed through the formation in waves. Arrouth fired at every aircraft that committed to an attack run. His ammunition burned away far faster than doctrine allowed. The barrels of his guns glowed from sustained fire. Time blurred into motion and sound. By the time the formation neared the target, Arrouth's world had narrowed to numbers and angles, distance, speed, closure, remaining rounds. And then the enemy pressed harder. As the formation reached the target area, the bombers leveled out. For the crews, it was the most dangerous moment of the mission. Bombers could not maneuver during the bombing run. They had to fly straight and steady while the bombardiers did their work. The German pilots knew it. The attacks intensified. A fighter came in low, angling beneath Aruth's guns, trying to slip through his blind spot. He forced the barrels down to their mechanical limit and fired anyway. The enemy pilot flinched, pulling up early. Cannon shells tore through empty sky instead of the bomber's tail. Another fighter followed, then another. The compartment shook violently. At one point, a fighter came straight in from dead astern, no weaving, no evasive movement. Either fearless or desperate. Aruth centered the aircraft in his gun sight and held the triggers down. The machine guns hammered for seconds that felt like minutes. Metal tore apart in midair. The fighter disintegrated, pieces flashing past the tail of the bomber. There was no time to watch it fall. A moment later, cannon fire slammed into the tail. The plexiglass shattered. Fragments ripped through Aruth's flight suit, slashing into his arm and shoulder. His left gun jammed instantly. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the compartment. The cold air burned like fire. Aruth kept shooting. One hand worked the remaining gun. The other pressed against his wounded arm, already stiffening from blood and cold. Another fighter filled his sight. He fired short, controlled bursts. The enemy aircraft rolled away trailing smoke, then vanished downward. The intercom crackled with voices, damage reports, shouts, warnings of flak ahead. Aruth tried to answer, but his mouth was dry. Blood pooled on the metal floor, freezing almost as soon as it touched the skin. His ammunition counter dropped relentlessly. Hundreds of rounds gone, then dozens, and the mission was only half complete. The bombs fell away beneath the formation, tumbling toward the target far below. For a brief moment, the bomber shuddered as its load vanished. Then the aircraft turned west. The return flight had begun. Michael Aruth remained in his compartment, barely aware of the shift in course. His focus stayed fixed on the sky behind him. His left arm had gone numb. The shattered gun was useless. Only one weapon remained. He checked the ammunition feed. 63 rounds, that was all. 250 miles of hostile airspace still lay ahead. The math had changed. There would be no more suppressive fire, no long bursts to force enemies away. Every trigger pull had to matter. The next attackers appeared over Belgium. Fresh aircraft replacing those lost earlier in the mission. Two fighters approached from low and behind, closing carefully. Aruth waited. At 500 yards, he fired a tight, deliberate burst. The tracers struck the lead fighter's engine. The aircraft rolled and dove, trailing fluid. The wingman broke off immediately. 51 rounds remained. The bomber crossed back into France as the attack slowly thinned. Fuel limits and losses forced the German fighters to disengage. Minutes stretched into an hour. At last, the English Channel appeared on the horizon. When the bomber touched down back in England, Aruth could not climb out on his own. Ground crew pulled him through the narrow hatch and carried him to an ambulance. Doctors counted multiple fragment wounds across his arm and shoulder. He had lost blood, but not consciousness. Word spread quickly through the group. A wounded tail gunner, multiple enemy fighters destroyed. One gun, 63 rounds. For the first time, official reports noted something unusual. Early engagement had kept the bomber alive. Michael Aruth spent weeks recovering from his wounds. The fragments had missed vital nerves and arteries. Against the odds, he would fly again, but his actions did not wait for his return. Combat reports circulated through the squadron. Gunnery officers reviewed film from tail-mounted cameras, watching streams of tracers reach far beyond the distances taught in training manuals. The pattern was difficult to ignore. Fighters broke off earlier. Attack runs became disorganized. Bombers returned with fewer holes in their skin. Other tail gunners began asking questions. Some quietly adopted their own versions of early fire. Others waited for permission that never officially came. The enemy noticed the change. German pilots reported that rear attacks were becoming more dangerous. Tracers appeared sooner, forcing evasive maneuvers before stable firing positions could be established. The Luftwaffe adapted. They increased approach speeds, diving harder to reduce exposure time. They shifted attack angles, using altitude and the sun to mask their runs. They began targeting aircraft that showed aggressive defensive fire. None of it restored the old advantage. Faster attacks reduced accuracy. Steeper dives made tracking difficult. Identifying specific gunners in the chaos of air combat proved nearly impossible. By late summer, Michael Aruth returned to duty. He climbed back into the tail of a new aircraft with the same calm preparation as before. Fresh guns, fresh ammunition. The next missions would push everything to its limit. The mission brief made the danger unmistakable. The target lay deep inside southern Germany, a heavily defended industrial city. The longest penetration the bomber force had attempted in weeks. Michael Aruth's group would fly in the lead position. Lead meant responsibility. Lead meant exposure. Lead meant absorbing the first attack. Before dawn, he inspected his guns personally. Both were newly serviced, barrels replaced. Feed mechanisms smooth. He loaded more ammunition than standard. Weight no longer concerned him. The formation launched into a low overcast and climbed steadily toward occupied Europe. Enemy fighters found them before they crossed fully into hostile airspace. The early attacks came from ahead, head-on passes that flashed by in seconds. Aruth watched contrails gather behind the formation. By mid-morning, the sky filled with interceptors. The rear attacks began suddenly and in force. A group of fighters climbed from below, pulling up together from the 6 o'clock position. Aruth opened fire early, tracers reaching out and forcing several aircraft to break away. Others pressed on. Cannon shells tore through the formation. Bombers took damage. Engines burned. Then one fighter dove from above and behind, using the sun to hide its approach. Aruth saw it too late. The impact slammed him into the plexiglass. His left gun was destroyed instantly. Fragments cut across his arms and scalp. Blood poured into his eyes. He wiped it away and kept firing with his remaining gun. The fighter rolled away trailing smoke, but the bomber was dying. Controls were sluggish. Fuel leaked from ruptured tanks. Engines faltered. Still, the aircraft held formation long enough to release its bombs. Only after the payload fell did the pilots break away. The decision came quickly and without debate. The bomber would not make it home. Tanlio descended into the gray waters of the English Channel. Impact at over 120 miles per hour. The fuselage broke apart instantly. Darkness swallowed Michael Aruth. When he awoke, he was floating in a life raft. The other crew members were nearby. All 10 had survived. The bomber lay on the channel floor, wreckage among the cold waves. Aruth's body bore the evidence of survival, 11 fragment wounds across his arm, shoulder, and upper back. His left hand was stiff, his throat dry from blood loss, his face streaked with grime. Within hours, the story spread through the 379th Bombardment Group, the tail gunner who had fired early, the one-handed, bleeding gunner who destroyed 3 enemy aircraft with just 63 rounds. The man whose aggressive technique had protected an entire bomber through the most lethal moments of the mission. Analysis followed quickly. The gunnery staff studied camera footage from the tail position. They noted that early engagement disrupted enemy attack runs. German pilots had to maneuver defensively, losing accuracy and coordination. Michael Aruth's approach, once considered reckless, became the subject of doctrine review. Other gunners began adopting variations of his method. Survival rates improved. Bombers returned with less damage. By September, the statistical correlation was undeniable. Aggressive, early fire worked. The 8th Air Force revised its gunnery guidelines. Tail gunners were now authorized to engage targets at extended ranges when tactical conditions permitted. The official language was cautious, but the meaning was clear. What had kept Aruth alive had become policy. Michael Aruth never saw the full implementation. His injuries forced a permanent grounding. Vision problems and recurring headaches ended his combat career. But his record was unmatched. 17 confirmed kills, 4 probables, multiple decorations including the Distinguished Service Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 Air Medals, and a Purple Heart. His methods would live on, shaping the tactics of gunners across all theaters of war. After the war, Michael Aruth did not leave the military. He transferred to the newly formed United States Air Force in 1947 and served for another 15 years. Combat had given him purpose. The skills he developed had saved lives, not just his own, but those of countless crews. His post-war years were quiet. He married, raised a family, and rarely spoke of the skies over Europe. The medals gathered dust in a drawer. The memories remained locked away, too heavy for casual conversation. Yet his legacy endured. The techniques he pioneered spread through training programs. Tail gunners across the 8th Air Force learned to challenge doctrine, to think independently, to survive where survival seemed impossible. Bomber loss rates declined. Enemy pilots adjusted. The air war became a contest of adaptation and intelligence, all shaped in part by one man's refusal to wait. Aruth attended reunions when his health allowed. He reconnected with survivors, remembered friends lost, shared lessons learned in silence. The 379th Bombardment Group's history archives preserved his mission reports, a record of courage, innovation, and defiance. Michael Arrouth passed away on February 15, 1990, in St. Augustine, Florida. He was 70 years old. His headstone marked rank, service branch, and war, silent on the 17 fighters destroyed, the crews protected, and the doctrine he had reshaped. Yet those who study history remember. The B-17 tail gunner position no longer exists. The aircraft themselves are museum pieces and memorials, but the principles Michael Arrouth demonstrated endure. The courage to act decisively, the willingness to challenge established rules, the drive to protect others even at great personal cost. He is one among thousands whose stories define the air war over Europe, stories that risk fading into silence if not told. And now, through this narrative, they live on. Michael Arrouth, the tail gunner who refused to wait, remains a symbol of heroism, intellect, and relentless resolve.